Here's another example of finding mass from a count. What is the mass of 90 apples if 1 dozen apples has a mass of 2 kilograms? And so again, sometimes we call this dimensional analysis, where we're just setting up a series of proportions or ratios to cancel units and eventually get to the unit that I want. So here's what we know. We have 90 apples. We know that a dozen is 12, and we know that a dozen has a mass of 2 kilograms. So we want to think like, okay, how can we get from the 90 apples to a mass? I'm looking for the mass of those 90s. I'm starting with a count, 90 apples. And I eventually see that the unit here that represents a mass would be kilograms. So I want to get from that count, that number of apples, 90 apples, I want to get to a mass of kilograms. That's the unit given that would measure mass. And so again, I just set up some proportions or ratios. So you start with what you're given, your given number. I have 90 apples. So I'm going to start with 90 apples. And we have to be obsessed with units. In science, all these numbers mean something. They represent something. So we have to put units behind every number in science. Okay, so I want to get out of this count of apples and eventually get over to that 2 kilograms. Well, that 2 kilograms, that's not per apple, that's per dozen. So we make a little pit stop in the middle, right? So they took the 90 apples, canceled apples. Let's cancel the 12 apples, and then on the top we'll turn it to a dozen. So I don't want apples, let's get it into the dozen. So 1 dozen on the top, that's what I wanted to switch it to. 12 apples on the bottom. I want to get rid of the apples. I'm turning it into a dozen. So right there, if you took 90 divided by 12, that would tell you how many dozen, right? Okay, which you could. I mean, if you wanted, you could stop there. But that's not really the final unit that I want. Right there, the unit that I didn't cross off initially would have been dozen apples. So 90 divided by 12 would tell me how many dozen. But then I want to turn that into kilograms or mass. So now I can just tack on another ratio or another proportion. I don't really want the final answer to be dozen. So let's put dozen on the bottom. And then the unit that I want, I can finally get. Because that 2 kilograms, that wasn't per apple, that was per dozen apples. So first we had to figure out how many dozen we have. Then we can cancel the dozen and switch it to mass in kilograms. So if you plug all this in your calculator, obviously you don't have to plug in like multiply by 1, divide by 1. But I'm thinking in my calculator in my head, 90 times 1 divided by 12 times 2 divided by 1 if you want to. Obviously you don't have to. So realistically, I don't put the ones in when I'm using my calculator. I would just say 90 divided by 12 times 2. I multiply by any numbers on the top and divide by anything on the bottom. And then I should have crossed off all the units except for the one that I want. I want kilograms of apples. So that should be all that's left on the top. Everything else is crossed off. So plugging this all in would give you, what do you know, 15 kilograms of apples. In concept, does that kind of make sense? That first we got to figure out how many dozen we have, and then it's 2 kilograms per dozen. Oh. So check out 4. Assume that 2 kilograms of apples is a dozen. Okay. And that each apple has 8 seeds. How many seeds are in 14 kilograms of apples? Okay, well let's start with what we got. We've got 14 kilograms of apples. 14 kilograms of apples. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, let's set up a little proportion. I don't want my final answer to be kilograms of apples. I want it to be like seeds, right? So I want to cancel kilograms. I know that I want to cancel kilograms. Oh man, what can I use here? Well, they say that 2 kilograms of apples is 1 dozen. Maybe I could use that relationship. 2 kilograms. I'll put the number in now. 2 kilograms is 1 dozen. I knew I wanted something where I could cancel kilograms. I don't want that in my answer. Well, the only relationship that I see in the given data is that 2 kilograms of apples is 1 dozen. So let's start there. And now that kilogram can cancel. That's out. So that's good. Okay, now I see that each apple has 8 seeds. Okay, so each apple. Well, that means I don't want this by dozen apples. I want to cancel dozen. I want this like per apple. Per apple. Well, could I say that there's 12 apples in 1 dozen? Sometimes it's helpful to like put the units in. And then let's see what that would do. So dozen and dozen would cancel. Okay. See if I like where my units are at. I got this out of kilograms. So if I were to take 14 divided by 2, that would be 7. So I have 14 kilograms. It's 2 kilograms per dozen. So 14 divided by 2 would give me a whopping 7, right? There's 7 dozen. Okay, so 7 dozen. That would be right in here. 7 dozen. Then each dozen is 12 apples. So now if I multiply that by 12, it would give me 84 apples. Right there, I'm at the number of apples. Well, I don't want the number of apples. I want the seeds. So we might need one more. I don't want apples. I want seeds. Yikes. So what does it tell me? That every 1 apple has 8 seeds. Check this out. Dimensional analysis is what we call this. The apple cancels. The only unit that I have left is the one that I want. Number of seeds. Now, for some of us, you can probably do this in your head, where you can kind of look at the relationships and yeah, maybe in your head you were saying, okay, well, there's 14 kilograms. It's 2 kilograms per dozen. I got 7 dozen. Well, there's 12 apples in a dozen. So 7 times 12 is 84 apples. There's 84 apples. They each have 8 seeds. Times 8. Holy buckets! 84 apples times 8 seeds gives me 672 seeds. It's a lot of seeds, huh? Maybe you can like talk through that in your head. And if that's the case, fantastic. However, when it comes to a summative assessment, you've got to show your work. We have to understand your thought process, what was going on in your head. So if that's what you did in your head, 7 dozen times 12 apples per dozen, that's 84 apples. It's 8 seeds per apple. There you go, 672 seeds. You have to write that all down so that we know you didn't just pull this out of your left nostril. We have to be able to understand the process that went on in your head to arrive at the answer. Now, eventually, when it comes to things like atoms and molecules, because, I mean, like, disclaimer, the rest of this course is not about apples and grapefruit and seeds. It's about atoms and molecules and chemical reactions and quantities and masses. But sometimes that's a little bit harder to picture in your head, because atoms and molecules are so crazy tiny, and we can't just count, okay, there's 8 atoms of carbon in this sample, there's 8 seeds per apple. I mean, eventually it gets to a point where we can't visualize things as well. And so that's kind of what we're preparing ourselves for. Like, what methods can we use to quantify things that are not as easy to process, that they're not easy to see and count ourselves? That's where this proportion method is going to become your bread and butter. So even if you don't need it now, we just want to make sure that it kind of makes sense, that we can set up these proportions where the unit that we want goes on top, the unit that we want to cancel will go on the bottom. And then eventually I really do like to cross off the units, so that I know I have it set up right if the unit that I want is the only unit that I have left. Then I plug it in my calculator, multiply by anything across the top, and I divide by any numbers on the bottom, ignoring the ones. So I really can plug this in my calculator as 14 divided by 2 times 12 times 8. 672 seeds.